Hi, my name is MHARDMAN and I'm going to be talking to you about my project, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Sacred Sites and Heritage Protection in Canterbury Bankstown Council region. So the project rationale, I broke down into three areas. So the context for this project was that Canterbury and Bankstown Council amalgamated in May 2016. At the amalgamation, all of the advisory committees for the councils dissolved, and that included the Aboriginal Advisory Committee, which left a gap in projects which promote Aboriginal activities and awareness raising. So that was one part of the reason. Another part was access. So there's really a lack of easy access for the public in terms of locating information on both Canterbury and Bankstown history regarding Aboriginal practices and preservation activities. And influence. I felt that the council was in a really good position to be able to develop and distribute information which then has a broad reach. So we're able to produce things that can then influence behaviours and influence how people connect to the land and how people care for the land and how they have a sense of ownership for the land. So my original proposal had three objectives. So the objectives for the project were to understand the previous and existing sustainability practices by Aboriginal and Torres Strait people in Canterbury Bankstown, to identify sacred sites in Canterbury Bankstown, document the history, the significance, restrictions and preservation activities, and also identify what contributes to the preservation or deterioration of particular sites. So also in terms of the personal objectives, I really wanted to refine my research skills because I often find that research, the scope can be so broad that I would really benefit from really understanding how to narrow and refine my research to things that are appropriate and credible sources. And the other objective was to do better in my time management skills. And that's purely because the nature of this internship placement project didn't really have the structure of a normal unit, so I thought that would be a useful skill to try and acquire. So the methodology for this project was broken into two parts. So mainly a research project, obviously that required high level of collaboration, but also it required individual research. So obviously through the collaboration, I needed to identify the stakeholders, and they're listed here, the diversity officers, and they actually are the ones working directly with our Aboriginal communities. A local elder who was identified through the diversity officer, the library staff who were able to help inform me about locating some of the historical documentation, and the environments team obviously informing me about the preservation and the environment-based activities. So in terms of the process that I used to define my project, so I identified the need using the stakeholders. I formulated the project proposal and then cross-checked that again with the diversity officer and the local elder, so consulting with them. I then conducted research and cross-referenced it, again it was that constant going back and forth with the diversity officer and the local elder. And then I consolidated the information to produce a resource, which is a map that details the findings and that also produces a visual for the community. So the key project aims being research and the resource. So the research was categorised into four areas that I was looking at. So I was looking at sacred sites, so Aboriginal and Torres Strait sacred sites in Canterbury Bankstown, looking at our rivers and creeks, other sites of cultural significance, and the preservation activities. And the aim of researching that was then to provide the detailed report, which then informs the resource. And the resource was the second part of this project. And the map's then distributed to the community, updated as required, and can be translated into various languages. It can be translated into Braille as well, and it can also have more visual elements if it's required. So just to give a bit of background to Canterbury Bankstown. So Canterbury Bankstown now as an amalgamated council sits across 2 Aboriginal lands, being the Gandagara and the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council. The Aboriginal people are the Bidjigal people of the Cadigal and Wongal clans, and the dominant language is Darug. Just a bit of interesting information here is that 2 of the prominent figures for the Aboriginal community was Pemulwuy and Tedbury, and they were resistance fighters, and they were best known for fighting at Bond's Farm, which is in Fudgebowl. The main activities that I was able to identify took place by the rivers and creeks, but then we can also see some of the occupation sites coming through as well in some of our sacred sites that I was able to identify. So to go on to the findings. So in terms of the sacred sites, we had hand stencils depicting 4 arms and 2 feet in Earlwood. So that's the image on the right. So that was formally recorded in the early 1970s, comprising of 23 hand stencils, 2 forearms and 2 white foot stencils, which is actually quite rare to find in New South Wales, with an assessment indicating a possible 3rd foot stencil. And the site is said to be between 1,000 to 5,000 years old. So prior to its protection, the site was actually lidded, and currently there's some issues around manual weed removal, and the position of the rocks actually exposed, meaning that the stencils are actually fading. So that's some of the issues in terms of its preservation at the moment. The image on the bottom left is hand stencils at Picnic Point. So in 1969, it was these Aboriginal hand stencils were first recorded at Yaramba Lagoon. I couldn't find much information about these sites other than that people in the community seemed to be aware of them. A local bushwalker actually, was aware of it and allowed a photographer to come and take photos of the site. So it's set along the Georges River, and for me, how I looked at this was that it was a protective factor because it was only accessible via bushwalking or via the Georges River. So I guess it preserves the site a little bit more from vandalism, from littering, and I think that's an important thing to consider. The 3rd image is of potential scar trees in Milperra on the former Riverlands Golf Course, and I say potential because those have yet to be confirmed, but there were 11 identified potential scar trees. Now, scar trees were typically used by Aboriginal people to produce canoes and make shelter, and the people standing in this image are from Bankstown Bushland Society, and they're very strongly advocating for the protection of these trees. And at the moment, there's a bit of an issue going on with council who are trying to push forward a residential development. So it's a really interesting place to be in terms of being at council and working closely with communities, because there definitely is that tension between the needs of the community in terms of housing and accommodation, but then also the needs of protecting the environment and making sure that heritage is preserved. So onto rivers and creeks. So there were 2 rivers and creeks, the Saltpan Creek and the Georges River and the Cooks River. So Saltpan Creek is the image on the right. It's now known as Padstow, the Saltpan Creek, and it was a former open campsite for Aboriginal people. Most of the activities in Saltpan Creek was fishing, so it was a food source, providing access to oysters, prawns, fish and wallabies. The site became a refuge and a bit of a place of political resistance during the 1930s for people escaping the Protection Board control. At the current state, GML Heritage, they've done an archaeological research and they've mapped the potential that these archaeological digs might uncover. So you see the orange shaded area there. That's a high sensitivity burial area. So it means that underneath there, there's potentially some really interesting findings. So in terms of the Cooks and the Georges River, it's a really important part of our history because 34% of the catchment sits within Canterbury Bankstown. The Georges River's previous name was Kayuma, and both rivers provided fish and shellfish, and there's actually records of dugongs in the Cooks River from around 6,000 years ago. The river was also used for travel purposes via canoes from the trees, as I was discussing before. The current preservation of the Cooks and Georges River is supported by our River Health Program, which monitors the water quality and the river populations. So that's a project that's active within Canterbury Bankstown Council and that people can volunteer to take part in. And it's also managed, the pollution is also managed through our pollution control devices, such as like litter booms, and they capture up to 18 cubic metres of litter per week. So other sites of cultural significance. So the Rage of Curiosities is the image on the right, and that's a kinetic installation by an artist called Graham Chalcroft, and it depicts trading, cultural exchange and the struggles between Aboriginal people and the colonial settlers. And the mosaic at the bottom, so that's at Gough Whitlam Park, and it depicts the Bidjigal people, the local rivers and the bush foods. And over here on the left you can see Pemulwuy and his son over on the right, just down the bottom, Tedbury, the resistant spiders we spoke about before. And it just depicts, again, like the rivers and the shellfish and the fish, and obviously the landscape. So again, other sites of cultural significance continued. So we've got the 7 peacekeepers. So this was an artwork that represents the travel of Aboriginal warriors along the Georges River. And when the warriors died, they turned into trees, and that's the representation there with the 7. And the Sylvan Grove Native Gardens is home to 64 types of Aboriginal bush foods. The bush foods were more than just food to Aboriginal people. They were crafted into utensils, canoes and other tools. So the Sylvan Grove Native Gardens are open to the public, and they do guided tours as well. So it's really about informing and enabling the community to understand Aboriginal heritage and to be engaged and connected. So in terms of Council's involvement in the preservation and protection of Aboriginal heritage, I was able to kind of understand 3 main types of preservation activities that we do. So the council runs its own environmental preservation projects, which are internal. So our Lake Gillawana project is about returning native plants and reducing excessive weed growth. And our Prairie Vale Reservation and Restoration project is about encouraging the return of native wildlife to the region. Our external activities, in terms of community engagement, we have a bush care program which supports our volunteers to remove weeds and plants and then also plant native vegetation and maintaining the wetlands. We've got 4 community gardens which the community can be involved in, and I think that's a really great way to connect to the land and have those conversations. Community tree planting events and our litter prevention programs, including things like the earn and return program. So less in those projects about Indigenous preservation, but it is about the preservation and sustainability of the environment and the land. So it's important nonetheless. And as I mentioned just briefly before, our River Health program. So that's a community-led program where individuals and groups gather water samples from both the Cooks and Georges River, and they produce these river health cards which help the council in river monitoring and management. And you can find out more on the website, and the details are below there. So what are the learnings? One of my original objectives for this project was to focus solely on sacred sites and identifying sacred sites in the preservation activities. What I learned pretty quickly was that the National Parks and Wildlife Act meant that I was unable to actually gather too much information about those sacred sites because they are protected. And I think that's a really important and positive thing. So I don't think, whilst it was a barrier, it really just meant that I needed to review the scope and really understand that Aboriginal history isn't just limited to what is preserved and protected, but it's also about the broader community and how we engage with the land. The second learning for me was that these findings are very small in the context of, I'm sure, what is out there. I was able to identify 9 actual sites and 3 preservation activities over a huge amount of land. So I think it's not representative of everything that's available out there, and that this is a small project that offers small insights into what I'm sure is a very bigger picture of the history of Aboriginal and Torres Strait people in Canterbury, Bankstown. Final learning is time management. It was a really good exercise in me learning how to manage my time and to plan activities. So for me, I feel that I'm a little bit better equipped to kind of set some milestones and timeframes for me, and I think the important thing for me was keeping to them. And again, in terms of my other personal objective with research, I think that was a little bit more challenging because I see the potential that this project could have to be much, much bigger. And so on reflection, I think, I did the best I could with the time that I had, but it's certainly, the scope certainly could have been expanded. So the resource, this is not a great image of it, but this resource was the final resource that was provided to the diversity officer and to the local elder that I was collaborating with. So the black dots represent sacred and heritage sites, the yellow dots represent the rivers and creeks, and the red dots represent other sites of cultural significance. And you've just got a brief breakdown of all of those sites, as well as the current preservation activities. So acknowledgements for this project, Turkan Akso was the team leader for diversity, and she was a great help in providing me some guidance and a bit of structure around how I could deliver this project with the community in mind. Uncle Harry Ali is a local elder and the former chairperson for our Aboriginal Advisory Committee, and he really helped reflect on some of the needs of the community and provided me with some resources and was cross-checking a lot of my information as I was sending it through. And Catherine Hardy and Jennifer Madden are technical local historian specialists from our library, and they were phenomenal in, again, providing me some of that local history, some of the documentation that I think would have had me trawling for hours and hours and hours. So it was fantastic to have their support. So thank you for listening.